The day Rhaenys first saw Sunspear, the air tasted of salt and iron and pomegranate, and Meraxes dipped her great head as if to drink the sunlight pooled on the sea. Dawn had roused the dragon before the princess had opened her eyes. Hunger did that, and wine did it, and the promise of miles. They glided low as the coast unrolled. Salt flats and wind-gnarled scrub, half-buried ruins glazed with mica, the pale scars of old rivers leading to a city like three black knives thrust into the sky. Rhaenys leaned forward to feel more of the breeze, her hands spread flat against warm scales. The sea was a shield hammered blue, the kind that bent but never broke, and the sun already rose with a Dornish sharpness she could taste on her tongue. Behind them lay ship wakes and the memory of red vantage towers along the marches. Ahead, the Shadow City crept like a dark tide toward the bastions of Sunspear, and beyond that, the parched hinterlands and the green ribbon of the river they called the Greenblood, which the Rhoynar claimed had once run clear as crystal and sweet as fate. Stories layered upon stories, all of them welded by heat. Rhaenys liked stories as other people liked wine. She gathered them everywhere she went. There were days when she could not tell if she was riding to conquer or riding to collect the taste of places, and put them like polished stones in her pocket. Aegon would laugh if she told him. Visenya would not laugh. Visenya would put a hand on Dark's sister and say, gently, that stones cut no throats. But today she had flown at Aegon's leave, and even Visenya had not barred her path. The banners had been planted from Blackwater to the Mander. The stony shore had licked its wounds and bent the knee. In the south, though, the sun had not bowed. Dorne had answered Dragonfire with shadows and the threat of sandstorms. Rhaenys had not come to take oaths by burning them out of men's backs. She had come because the old woman who ruled this hard country had sent a letter in a fine crabbed hand. If your sister wishes to speak with me, let her come with only the one she trusts most in all the world. I am old and do not fear to die. I do fear to waste breath on men who taste victory and only want more. Those were not words to make a sword leap in its scabbard. Those were words that opened a door. Rhaenys had wrapped the letter in blue silk and kept it at her breast on the flight over, and now, as Meraxes circled, she could hear the Shadow City wake. Vendors calling, dogs barking, a lute thrumming a low ribbon of sound beneath it all. The dragon let out a grumble that was almost human in its impatience. Rhaenys stroked the ridge of bone between the beast's eyes and felt the purr of it enter her bones. We'll find shade, she told Meraxes, smiling into that blind brightness where dragon gaze rested, and meat, and a place to set our feet where the wind can speak to us and not just at us. Mande. They settled on baked earth in the shadow of Sunspear's spear tower, that impossible lance of black basalt with its sharpness dulled only by distance. The Tower of the Sun flanked it, square and older, the sort of thing that endured by not seeming to try, and between them ran a gate like a slit of night, guarded by two men with coppery skin, and the sleek look of cats too smart to hunt when meat could be begged from richer houses. They bowed their heads but not their backs, one hand on the hilts of curved blades, the other lifted in a gesture that meant welcome and watchfulness both. A man in saffron robes waited within the shadow of the gate. He had a face as smooth as a polished stone and eyes that weighed more than they showed. "Princess," he said, and Rhaenys was not entirely certain whether he spoke to her or to the dragon. "The old princess waits. We have prepared a pool to soothe your dragon's thirst." "Madame Sao." "Meraxes drinks the sky," Rhaenys said, and the man, no older than 45, with sable hair looped behind his neck by a narrow ring of gold, smiled as if at a private pleasantry. "Even the sky is brackish near Sunspear," he said. "She will like the taste of our wells better. Come if you please. I am Maester Tiro." Seconded from the citadel at Old Town 30 years, and likely to die here if I may, for I have never been so content in a place that tries so constantly to kill you. Nensao. He spoke Valyrian with the soft rasp of Old Town vowels, a man who had learned in cloisters and kept the language polished like a favored cup. Rhaenys followed him inward, Meraxes pacing beside them for a dozen steps, until the gate narrowed and the dragon peeled away with the offended dignity of a large creature refusing to pretend to be small. She felt the brush of wings as the great beast vaulted back into the dangerous clean air. She was never happier than in that hum at the edge of hearing that told her her dragon was near. Inside the Tower of the Sun, the heat abruptly cooled. The air smelled of limes and a faint bitterness like crushed bay leaf. The walls were stone veined darker than rain, hung with woven scenes. A river crowded with boats. A woman on a white horse, riding through reeds taller than any man. A harvest of oranges piled like sunset itself in shallow baskets. Candles trembled in alcoves, their flames hardly moving. Rhaenys saw, beyond an open archway, the glimmer of water. She heard the sigh of it. The sound loosened something in her shoulders she had not known was tight. They did not go to the pool. Maester Tiro led her to a high room whose windows were unglassed and carved into rounded lozenges that made a honeycomb of light on the floor. There, on a chair so low it was almost a cushion, sat Princess Miria Martell. She was very old. Time had not smoothed her. It had sharpened her to points. The skin of her hands lay in folds, but the fingers were rings of iron. Her hair was white and pulled back into a cord. Her eyes were blind, a milky blue filmed with shadows that had eaten the pupils long ago. She wore saffron too, but hers was faded like parchment and banded with narrow strips of indigo. Beside her stood a younger man. No, not young, but younger than all that age at least, who had the easy balance of a swordsman and the long mouth of a man who could smile quickly and mean it. His hair was close-cropped and sun-browned. He wore no jewels save a thin twist of gold upon his left thumb. Rhaenys sank into a bow that was almost a dance. When she rose, Miria's blind gaze seemed to find her. "So," said the old woman, "the one who loves songs has come. I had wondered if the one who loves swords would come instead." "Visenya does love swords," Rhaenys said, "and men who look too long at her learn to love them as well. But you asked for the one I trust most. That is Merax's, and Merax's trusts me." The old woman's mouth tucked in. "Truth comes in such unusual packages. This is my grandson, Nymor. He likes songs too. He will tell you that his favorite is about a boy who stole a boat to meet a girl who sat on a rock and sang his name. He lies. His favorite is the one where the girl steals the boat to leave the boy on the rock." "Grandmother," said Nymor, patient. "It is good to be honest from the first," Miria said. "Sit, princess, where my eyes used to be. Let me hear how you breathe. I will take your measure with my ears." Then, Rhaenys sat without any of the delicate discomforts that etiquette instructors tried to wrap around her like gauze. Miria's room was not a place for gauze. The floor tiles were a chaos of blues and golds, the cushions striped like the throats of desert birds. Through one of the honeycomb windows, she heard the city. A quarrel's quick rise and fall, a mule's resentful snort, the ringing of a hammer on something that struck back. Even here, inside this old princess nest, Dorne pressed in, bright and hot and alive. "Aegon burns cities," Miria said. "Your sister cuts throats. You sing songs and fly for the joy of it. Why have you come to me?" "I would know you," Rhaenys said. "You send back my men with their hair singed and their armor hot enough to blister their own skins. You refuse to come out and meet our lords on any field a painter would be proud to depict. You move with the shadows, and when we chase you, the shadows are elsewhere, and the water we try to drink turns to dust in our throats. And yet your letters are very fine. Quarthine silk of words. I have come to speak where the wind cannot steal the ends of sentences." "Da." Rhaenys thought she saw a flicker at the corner of the old woman's mouth. "Sunspear is stones and people," Miria said. "The stones are mine. The people are more stubborn. In other lands, a lord is owner of men. In Dorne, men are owner of themselves. I can set my weight to a matter. If they do not wish it, they may choose another road and leave me seated." "Menawender." "You would have me believe," Rhaenys said, playing with the tassel of a cushion and feeling the abrasion of twisted thread against her fingertip, "that you do not command Dorne." "It is not belief," Miria said. "It is weather." Namor shifted, not a fidget. It was the movement of a man who had been still a long time. "Princess," he said, "I have stood inside a sandstorm and felt the ground ripple beneath my feet as if it were water." In such a moment, a man may shout orders at the wind, or he may lash himself to a root and pray. It is useful to know which one he is doing. "Ben?" Rhaenys liked the sound of his voice. It was not a soft voice. Softness, here, would only be pretense, the sort of trick a traveling mummer used. It was a voice that could be heard across a courtyard in bright sun and not be lost. She met his gaze. He did not look away, but neither did he wield his eyes like a weapon. "Aegon's banners," Miria said, and her blind face tilted toward a window, as if she could read the colored light on the floor, "have crept toward my gates. I am old enough to remember a time before this house was mine. I remember the faces of men who thought spears would give them what they could never hold. Aegon's fire frightens men. You have learned that the frightened can be driven. But if you drive a herd too hard, it breaks apart. And then, what are you shepherding? Dust devils. My land is good at making those. It hid us from your men, and it will hide us again. How long do you wish to chase wind?" "Nisi. I could burn Sunspear," Rhaenys said. "I could burn the Shadow City and your salt pans and your ships, and this tower, and that spear, and the limes on your trees. I could leave your old bones on a chair in an empty room." "You could try," Miria said, and the barest shadow of a smile touched her lips. "I am blind, not foolish. Your dragon is very large, but fire has a nature. It eats what is put in its path, and then it starves. We have made a country out of the art of starving a thing while feeding ourselves. Your brothers... No. Forgive me, husbands. You three are as much a knot as any I have seen. Your husbands will learn this too, if they insist on teaching us what death means. Now. And yet you wrote to me." Rhaenys felt the coolness of the stone seep through the soles of her sandals. Her ankles liked the cool. The rest of her yearned to be on the roof. "I wrote," Miria said, "because I am old, and I do not wish my grandchildren to live a short and glorious tale that other men will sing. I wrote because I have heard stories from sailors who have seen your dragons rip the sky. I wrote because the way to survive the wind is sometimes to tilt with it, and let it put you where you can balance. And I have seen what you are, princess. You are the one who balances." "Ben Dal." Namor said nothing, but he shifted again, and this time Rhaenys knew it for agreement. "How would you tilt us?" she asked. Miria did not reply at once. Her breath was the hushed whisper of a silk garment folded and refolded. "Dorne is not like your other conquests. We do not kneel well. We bend to drink, and we bend to love, and we bend when we are old, because our backs ache. But kneeling is for those who like to look at the tops of shoes. We do not. If you would have our spears beside your banners, you must give us a reason to stand straight and not feel the weight on our necks." Benda whined. "What would you keep?" Rhaenys asked. "Our laws," Miria said. "Our right of inheritance. Our name for our prince. Our right to raise our own banners in our own quarrels, save when the whole realm calls to arms. No Targaryen garrisons in our keeps without invitation. No whip, no rack. No man's will pressed on a woman's body. We remember Nymeria. We remember what she vowed when she burned her own ships." "None?" Rhaenys heard in those words a rhythm older than the room, as if Miria were laying out a cloth woven before either of them had been born. The weave held. She knew too that the list was not complete. There would be smaller stitches that did not show until you ran your nail against them. "And what would you give?" Rhaenys asked softly. Miria crooked a finger, and Maester Tiro put a cup into her hand. The old princess drank. Her throat worked. When she lowered the cup, a bead of water clung briefly to the corner of her mouth, and then fell back into the cup, as if it had a home there. "A marriage," Miria said. "Not a hostage and not a concubine. A marriage that binds your line to mine and makes a bridge between the salt and the old blood of the river. The sun upon the spear and the dragon who drinks the sky. Nymor has not yet taken a wife. He is quick and not cruel, and he is young enough to be taught." "And he is young enough to be taught." Rhaenys did not let her breath change. She did not look at Nemor, though she felt the nimble jump of his attention as clearly as if he had touched her arm. The room turned in her head like a wheel. The shape of it fit too well. The heat seemed suddenly a little warmer, but that might have been the imagined flare of Visenia's eyes if Rhaenys brought this back like a dove with strange fruit in its beak. "You would have me," Rhaenys said. "Take your grandson to husband." "I would have him take you?" Miriah said. "We will go on calling our rulers princesses and princes. We will go on claiming our inheritance with the law that will not cheat a daughter. You may come and be ours. We will go and stand with you when the banners lift in other lands. We are tired of men burning our oranges and leaving our wells poisoned." Then shall. At last Rhaenys looked at Nemor. He met her gaze again. His eyes were a brown so dark that the light in the room made them a mirror instead of a color. He cocked his head a fraction. His mouth held no grin. He looked, she thought, like a man who had watched the wind from a roof at night and learned its politics. "What do you say, Prince?" she asked. "I say," he said, "that I have ridden the green blood with the orphans of the river and slept under a pole of rags with my feet in canal mud. And I have sat in this chamber until my bones ached. Both are Dorn. I have seen your dragon. I have never married a dragon. I am curious." "Curiosity," said Miriah, "did not kill Nymeria." "No," Nymeria said, "but it set her ships ablaze." Rhaenys' laughter was not a dignified thing. It escaped like a bird. Maester Tiro, who had ceased to be part of the furniture the moment she heard the color in his voice, smiled in satisfaction as if a recipe had proven true. "You ask much," Rhaenys said to Miriah, when the laughter had folded itself away. "You ask for a road with a bridge, and then a path that belongs to only one set of feet." "I ask for a future," Miriah said. "I ask to be neither corpse nor footstool." Rhaenys rose and went to the window. The honeycomb lozenges lay light upon her hands when she set them against the cool stone. Below, the shadow city squared its shoulders to the day. She could see a boy in a blue shirt, running with a basket of figs, and an old man seated on a stool, with his feet in a tub, and a woman drawing water from a cistern with such economy of motion that Rhaenys wanted to applaud. Over all of it, the spear of the tower watched the sun climb. Farther out, a white gold shape curved low. "Mirax is playing with wind." Visenya would say, "Dornish schemes." Aegon would say, "What say you to sealing it in steel?" The Reachlords would gnash their teeth, the Marcher Lords would spit into their cups, and yet, she could feel how the knot might hold. She could feel, too, the tug in herself. Curiosity had always been her ruin and her redemption. "Give me a day," she said, still with her hands on the stone, "and bring me to your river." Miriah's head shifted as if following an old bird in a familiar courtyard. "To the Greenblood? You will melt for 2 hours and then be made again out of water." "I have melted before," Rhaenys said. "I like seeing how my shape changes when I cool." The day uncoiled like a snake and lay with her length in the heat. They went down through the shadow city, where the lanes were strangled by shade and lashed together by linen cords hung with bells. Rhaenys wore a gown so thin she could feel the weight of the dust on her calves, and she went bare-armed and bareheaded because she wanted the sun to make a map of her. Nemor walked a half-pace ahead and half a pace to the side, which told her as much about him as any conversation. When men tried to pretend they did not stand ready to put themselves between a woman and danger, she distrusted their theater. He carried only a short, recurved knife with an ironwood grip. The hilt bore shallow notches that had no pattern she could decipher, and every pattern she could guess. The river lay like a green wound, wide and slow and salt-sour near the mouth. The planks of the old Rhoynar boats scumbled with lime to keep them from splintering in the heat. Children ran along the banks with pots of glimmering fish. Women washed garments by standing in the shallows and striking cloth on stones while telling stories to each other with their eyebrows. A flute twined with a pipe and made a vine of music. A woman with hair bleached near white by sun and eyes, the color of tarnished coins, waited by a skiff, strung with faded pennants. When Nemor came near, She straightened and offered Rhaenys a cup made of carved gourd. The water inside tasted of limes and metal, and nothing else so much as relief. Rhaenys closed her eyes to drink and opened them to find the woman smiling at her as one smiles at a child who has understood a joke. "I am Lara of the Orphans," she said. "And this river is our mother when she is kind, and our stepmother when she is not. Come, I will show you where the reeds sing." Benendo. Rhaenys had grown up with spray and cliff, and the sky turning itself inside out in storms. This was different. The sky here was a lid. The water was a road. The reeds were... She found herself listening to them as if they told secrets. The skiff's bottom scraped. The wind made little licks at her ankles. Children swam like small brown fish under the surface and rose, blowing water like dolphins. Her hand trailed over the side. The heat did not recede so much as it rearranged itself. It moved out of her skull and into the world, and the hum inside her bones that was the distant beat of Merax's wings settled into a companionable whisper. Lara told her tales in a voice that made each one a piece of river clay kneaded into shape. She told of the days when Nymeria had led her 10,000, of how in that time there were mothers who could not count their tears and tools that mourned for the hands that had used them. She told of a prince of Dorne who had loved a boy from the Shadow City and never married, so that the laws had to bend or break, and in bending had become stronger. She told of a girl who had been found in a fig crate, and had grown to be a fishwife who swam farther into the tide than any man, and came out with a net full of silvery eels that tasted like the way a long-lost song might taste. "This is not like your northern rivers," Nymor said. When Lara's stories rested, "It is slow. It looks lazy. It remembers violence. Once it rose and ate everything all the way to the courtyard of Sunspear. Then it went back to pretending it could only float a skiff. Then, everything here is very polite about its power," Rhaenys said. "I think that is what frightens men from the Reach very much. They build with green," Nymor said. "We build with thirst." She could have kissed him then in simple admiration for the fit of his words. She did not. She kept her hands folded in her lap and watched a dragonfly that was the exact color of the sky if the sky had been dipped in midnight. When they returned to Sunspear, the light lay like thrown metal in the court, where Miria had maids water the stone to smooth the evening. Rhaenys stood under a woven awning and shook the river from her sleeves. Miria listened to the description of Reed's song the way a man might listen to figures that add to a sum he needs. When Rhaenys had finished speaking, the old princess said only, "You will not sleep until you have taken your dragon up again. Do it before your flesh sits too heavy upon your bones." So Rhaenys climbed the spear tower stairs by the dimming light, and then climbed higher into the dark that was only not night because the sun had left its stink behind. Meraxes knew her as soon as the wind knew her, a sudden affectionate buffet of hot breath, and the gleam of an eye like a coin at the bottom of a deep well. Rhaenys swung into the saddle, and the dragon leapt, and then they were beyond stone, beyond cloth, beyond any language that a room could hold. They skimmed the spear's spire, and banked, and balanced, and let the night come up like a lover. She dreamed on the roof afterward, because Meraxes liked her near. The stars were as thick as sand. The heat lifted only a little. She dreamed of bridges, one of stone with a dragon carved along the railing, one of rope that swung over a gorge that smelled like iron, one that was not a thing you walked upon at all, but a set of vows spoken so exactly that the air took on the shape of a passageway. In the dream, Visenya stood at the far end of that last bridge, her hair about her like burnt silk, and Aegon sat on a rock beside the rope bridge, patient and heavy with waiting. Rhaenys woke with the taste of lime in her mouth, though she had not drunk anything. She sent a raven at dawn with a letter to Aegon. She did not dress the letter in silk. She told him what Miria had asked, what she had offered, and what Rhaenys thought the thing could become if all the hands in their knot pulled the right way. She wrote, "They do not kneel well. I do not think they should." She wrote, "I wish to help break the habit we have of believing that fire is the only language anyone hears." She wrote, He's a man I could like in the way that does not make me lesser." While the raven found its direction and shouldered the day, Rhaenys walked with Nymor through a market of spices where the air itself felt powdered in fennec browns and saffron yellow. Women sat with black hair piled high, combs like spears quilled there. Men wore white with open throats and belts bound twice around their middles. A boy carved dates into flower shapes and skewered them like brown chrysanthemums. An old woman sharpened knives by running them across an oily strip of leather while telling a story so filthy that Rhaenys choked and then laughed. The stall owners called to Nymor by name. He answered each with a word that was not always a promise, but always sounded like one. At a stand near the end of the market, a little girl with a scar across her lip sold strips of dried limes and a salt that tasted like smoke and violets. She would not look at Nymor. She looked fixedly past his shoulder with the fierce concentration of the shy. Rhaenys bought all the lime strips and half the salt. The girl counted every coin twice and then said, without looking up, "My mother says you bring storms with your hair." "Do I?" Rhaenys said. "I try not to bring storms to market. They slow the counting. Storms make men stop and look up," the girl said. She slid another paper twist of salt onto the table, as if by accident. "I like it when men have to look at the sky and think of something else." "Good," Rhaenys said. "Look up whenever you can." Men looked down often enough without any encouragement. When the raven returned, it came with two. Aegon's handwriting was spare and large. Visenius was a map of a city that did not exist and yet was entirely clear. Aegon wrote, "Come home and let us talk. If the sun will not kneel, we will learn how to sit together. Bring him if you decide. If he will come." Visenya wrote, "We will need to know every stitch in the cloth before we wear it. Men will bring knives to cut what they cannot untie. Do not be distracted by the shine of a new thing." Rhaenys read the last line aloud to Nymor and saw something in his mouth that was halfway to laughter. "Swordswoman's wisdom," he said. "Wisdom regardless," Rhaenys said. "Come to Dragonstone. Meet my knot as your grandmother named us. See if the wind blows there the way it does on your towers." Nymor's lips thinned a little. It was not fear. She knew what fear smelled like, and it was a clean smell when it was honest. This was the acceptance of having to wear a shirt that no longer fit, uncomfortable and necessary. "If I go," he said, "they will say I went to give our spears to a man who eats the world." "If you do not go," Rhaenys said, "they will say you let the world eat you." "I am less concerned with what they say than with whether it is true," Nymor said. And that was a sentence she could have married by itself. Miria did not see them off. She did not climb to roofs, and she did not climb onto parapets, merely to appease notions of grandmothers and goodbyes. She sat in her honeycomb room and held a string of beads that Rhaenys had thought a decoration until the old woman's fingers moved, and the beads clicked, and Rhaenys realized it was how Miria counted heartbeats for men too far away for her to see. Maester Tiro handed Nymor a roll of parchments that smelled faintly of oil and orange peel. Lara of the Orphans stood in the courtyard with her pipe tucked through her belt and said, "Bring back Rhaenys." They rose. Meraxes did not like the weight of two, but she did not object either. For Rhaenys, the dragon would have flown with a tower's worth of men strapped to her back. The sea shivered under them. The wind was less polite over water. Namor held himself with that swordsman's economy. Rhaenys felt the steadiness with her back. She found she did not mind it. She found, in fact, that she minded its absence when they landed, as if her body had grown used to that one particular point of balance. Dragonstone smelled of old smoke and iron, and the remembered roar of fires that were not in any hearth. The day had turned sullen and gray by the time they reached it. The great dragon gargoyles hunched along the parapets, as if waiting to give counsel none would like. Rhaenys had grown in this light. These were her stones, meaning bent differently here. Nymor looked at it all as if he had stepped into a deep shade and was letting his eyes learn the edges before he moved his feet. They found Aegon in the long hall where the banners hung heavy as fog. Visenya stood at his shoulder. He was a big man in the way mountains are big when you are far enough to see them entire and close enough to feel how little they move. He wore no crown. He held no sword. He looked at Nymor as a smith looks at a piece of metal he might shape. "Prince Nymor of Dorne," Rhaenys said. My husband Aegon, my sister-wife Visenya. Nemor bowed. He did not kneel. The not kneeling was part of the fabric before any hands touched it, and Rhaenys watched Visenya's eyes as a hunter watches for the ripple in grass that is more than wind. Visenya's mouth did not change. That did not matter. Rhaenys knew her. We have read your grandmother's letter, Aegon said. And my sister's. Her letters are better, Nemor said. Aegon's mouth twitched. Visenya's did not. You asked to be part of our realm, Visenya said, and you asked to be not part. You would have both. Dorne has always had both, Nemor said. We are not trying to turn a sandhorse into a seahorse. We are saying we will bring our sandhorse to your stable, and when the realm must ride, we will ride together, but we will not cut off its legs to teach it to swim. Your realm's laws, Aegon said, do not favor it. We are the kings of the Andals and the Rhoynar, and the first men. This is the song people have learned to sing. Then sing it and add a verse, Nemor said. Rhaenys liked him more each time. She stood a little nearer to him, and let the hall feel that it was not an error of light. Visenya saw it. Aegon did too. He rubbed his thumb along his jaw as if thinking of the rasp of a beard. If we are to add a verse, Aegon said, we must choose the time and the music. The marchers will rage. The Hightowers will pretend to be mild and will write many letters. The Lannisters will smile like cats. The Starks will nod once and go on watching snow. I have managed men with swords. I have not managed this yet. Benty, Rhaenys said, softly. You have managed me. Not so much as I pretended, Aegon said, as if the admission were a comfortable garment he had been waiting to put on. There's the question of faiths. There is the question of oaths. There is the question of garrisons. No garrisons, Nemor said. Save by invitation, Rhaenys said, to show her husband that she could carry a thread without tangling it. And invitation will not be made lightly, because the making will be public. Let us not write so much by voice, Visenya said. Let us do this as if we intend not to be murdered in our beds. They went to the chamber where they set their treaties like eggs into the nests of beautiful boxes. Maesters came with sand to dry ink. Dragons slept on stone in the afternoon air and turned the dreaming of the castle toward warmer imaginings. Rhaenys bent her head and wrote out the points they had already named. And when she did, she found her hand steady in a way it sometimes was not when men spoke of steels. Nemor wrote a line in his flowing Dornish hand that said, no woman shall be forced to marry where she will not, nor be pressed beneath a man's weight without her consent. Visenya did not blink. Aegon looked at it for a long moment, and then nodded once. When the parchments lay in a neat row, Rhaenys folded her hands and looked at Nemor until he looked back. We have not written the part where I am given to you, she said. I would prefer the part where you come to me, Nemor said. Given is a word that tastes of purchase. You speak my language, Rhaenys said. You speak mine, Nemor said. They rode the air with Balerion and Vhagar to seal the thing in sight, as well as script. Over Old Town, the high tower sent up pennants like watered silk. And 1,000 bells rang, and the face of the man in the high tower's highest gallery did not betray the sums he was already making in his head. Over the reach, harvesters paused and watched and made the sign against evil, and then turned back to their grain. Over the marches, men looked up with narrow eyes and made promises to themselves in ugly words. In the Riverlands, a fisher boy pointed, and his father said, Aye, and so it is. In the north, a raven landed on a shoulder and was not struck away. News made its roads faster than horses could. Oris Baratheon wrote from Storm's End, I know the marchers. You are right to do it this way with eyes and ink. They will want to smash the pot. You will have to feed them the stew instead. They returned to Sunspear to marry. Rhaenys wore white that looked like the inside of an orange skin, and her hair was loose and unpinned, so that the wind could take a portion as its fee. Nemor wore a belt of gold rings linked by leather and a sash, as blue as a cool tile in a shaded room. They stood with their feet in a basin of water, because the Rhoynar remembered where they had come from, and they spoke vows with their hands joined above the surface, so that the reflected words as well as the spoken ones would count. Lara played the pipe, and the reeds outside whispered, and the people threw not grain but twists of salt that stung Rhaenys' bare arms like affectionate bees. Miria sat in her chair with the beads in her hand and did not pretend that she could see. And when the part came where the elder of the house set a palm upon the heads of the pair and spoke a blessing, she laid her hand upon both their crowns and said, "May you work at love the way fishwives work a net, together, until your fingers bleed, and when the fish escape, may you laugh for the ones that did not." Rhaenys and Nemor made a home on a cliff near Sunspear, where the stone cooled in the night like bread, left to rest, and Meraxes could lie with her tail hanging over the edge, like a living banister. The room where they slept smelled of lime oil and dragon skin, and the faint sweetness of water kept in jars. They did not ask the maids to bring braziers. They slept with the heat. In the mornings, when the sun threw knives through the windows, Rhaenys woke to find Nemor watching the light as if it were a rival lover. And she would touch the corner of his mouth with a finger, because she had learned that made the mouth turn toward her. In the days that followed, men came with gifts in their mouths and knives under their tongues. Some were from the Reach and spoke of commerce as if they invented it. Some were from the marches and spoke of old grievances as if they were heirlooms to be shown at a wedding. Some were from the north of Dorne and had hands scarred by lathered horses and eyes that had learned never to be empty. Rhaenys walked beside Nemor when he greeted them and let him be the first to set the tone, and she was quick in adding a note or harmony that turned mere tone into music. She had always been good at hearing what could be made. Visenya wrote letters that had the exact number of words to be effective for the exact number of days required. Aegon sent gold where it smoothed but not where it cut. And when the Marcher lords glowered, he rode to their keeps one by one, and sat their tables, and made them call him cousin, which was a lower, deeper oath than most men realized until it choked them. 2 moons after the marriage, when the salt had been washed from the courtyard stones and the fig trees had given up their sweetness, and begun to think of winter, a rumor climbed the spear tower wearing soft shoes. The Yarnwoods had not sent their full oath. They had sent a version of it, like a boot with one lace missing. And everyone saw it and pretended not to, because pretending can be a useful weapon when used by the right hands. Rhaenys read the letter and watched Nemor's mouth and thought of rope bridges and stone ones and vows that shaped the air into a passageway. "We will go," she said. "We will go," he said. They did not go with dragons. They went with 20 men and 20 women, half of them from Sunspear and half of them from the orphans, because you do not go to the green when you mean to talk without bringing those who know what water has to say. The road north was a line drawn on a cheek by a woman who had fallen asleep in her paint. At night, the stars were teeth, and the wind chewed the tents. Rhaenys learned the names of small birds with dust-pale feathers. She learned the way the air changed an hour before dawn. Nemor learned the soft syllables of her Valyrian when she murmured them to herself to keep the pace in her mind. At Euronwood, the towers were made of a stone that looked green only because the light wanted it to be. Lord Euronwood had a face like a plowshare. He had learned how to bend without breaking and liked to show men the notch where his spine had taken a forced curve and returned to line. "We have sworn to Dorne," he said to Nemor. "We have not sworn to foreign kings. You have sworn to your own laws," Nemor said. "Keep them, and you will find we are already all sworn to the same thing. We do not trust dragons." "They do not trust you," Rhaenys said, smiling. "Dragons are very conservative animals." The plowshare mouth scowled at her, but she saw curiosity there too, and that was a thing she could put a finger beneath and lift. They ate spiced goat and bitter greens and a pudding that had been boiled too long. Rhaenys took second helpings of everything because hospitality is a kind of oath. And when at last the night was a wool that had been well worn at the elbows, she and Nemor and Lord Ronwood went out to stand where the wind could "You march a road between 2 prides," Lord Euronwood said to Nemor, as if he had waited to be able to say it without an audience. "You will be given blame by both." "I will also be given the chance to have both," Nemor said. "Blame tastes worse and lasts less." You speak like a man with his hands in two baskets, Lord Euronwood said. Do not drop either. If you do, I will say I warned you, and then I will pick up what you dropped. Good, Rhaenys said before Nemor could answer. It is good to know who will snatch what from the ground when we stumble. It allows us to choose our footing better. Lord Euronwood looked at her as if she were a horse that had answered a question. You should have been born to Dorne, he said, without kindness and without unkindness. You would have fought us to a better draw. Rhaenys bowed a little and not too little. I am trying now. When they left Euronwood, the morning smelled of flint and sheep. Meraxes shadowed them once, high and careless, the curve of her belly like the crescent of a second moon. Rhaenys felt in herself that hungering to climb and leave the weight of language behind, but she had made a road of words now, and she walked it. As the moons turned, the verse added itself to the old song a few lines at a time. Ravens went and came. Banners lifted and settled. A boy in the Stormlands wrote a clever satire, and was beaten for it, and then privately praised by the man who had ordered the beating. In Old Town, a maester wrote 5 treatises on the legal implications of immunity, and then fell in love with a woman from the Shadow City, and took his ribbons off, and went to live by the green blood, with a pipe and a carved gourd. In King's Landing, the name only beginning to stick like burrs in a dog's fur. Aegon set aside a space within the big new hall where a fountain would one day sing in summer, and Visenya set aside a locked chest where she kept the letters that mattered most, tied with a ribbon neither of them had seen before Rhaenys brought it from Dorne, the blue of the tiles in Miria's court. Some nights, Rhaenys woke with the city's light in her mouth and the taste of salt, and Nemor would turn and press his face to her hair and breathe in, and she would feel his breath push back against all the old words and make room for the new ones. Some mornings she flew and cut the sky into ribbons that fell in silence over the sea. Some afternoons, she sat with Miria, who was less present each week and more intense in the moments when her hands found the beads in the exact right order. You have built a bridge, the old woman said once. Bridges are more honest than oaths. Oaths depend on the moods of men. Bridges depend on physics. Man? I like both, Rhaenys said. You would, Miria said, and her dry old mouth made something that might have been a smile if it had not been so purely itself. You are the river's child now, even with your dragon's tongue. When Miria died, it was as if a candle winked out in a room where the sun already shone. The loss was not darkness, but a change in the way the light could be used. Nemor stood with the beads in his palm and did not weep, which did not mean he did not grieve. Rhaenys had learned the grammar of his face by then. The orphans of the river sang a song about boats with no sails that still found their way, and the marchers sent a letter of formal regret with a second letter tucked beneath it that suggested a hunting party near the borders as a show of friendly steel. Visenya wrote a third letter for Aegon to sign that thanked them with words so exact that the men did not realize they had been told to stay home until they were already almost undressed. Time laid down tracks. Wheels ran on them. The year turned, and the oranges came again, and the law about women's consent went into the little books trainees carried when they were learning to enforce bigger laws. A woman in the Reach wrote to her sister in Dorne and asked what the air felt like there when it rained. The sister wrote back, "It is like a man who has been unkind and is trying to be better in the exact way you asked for, and he still gets it wrong, and you forgive him because he is trying, and because the trying is wet." A day came when Rhaenys stood on the cliff house balcony and watched 3 sails approach that she knew by color and cut. Hightower men, with Hightower mouths and Hightower stomachs, wearing expressions that said they had learned polite words in a hurry. Namor came to stand beside her. He was a man who had learned to swim in heavier cloth. She slipped her hand into his and did not make anything of it with words. "We will feed them fish in a sauce they are not ready for," he said. "We will tell them a joke with 2 meanings. We will promise them what we can afford and not what they ask. We will sell them salt by the violin string," Rhaenys said. He turned his head. "That is not an expression I know. It is not an expression at all," she said. "I like the way it tastes." He kissed her hair. Simply. Your hair has brought us many storms. And rain, she said. And rain, he agreed. Meraxes huffed behind them and lowered her head until the balcony stones trembled. Rhaenys turned and set her forehead against the great scaled skull and breathed the dragon's breath and tasted old fire and knew how. Below, the sea found the rocks with all the patience of a deep intelligence. Above, the sun slid a little west and cut the spear's shadow shorter. The bridge held, and men crossed it. And women crossed it. And sometimes they threw stones from the edges to hear the splash, and sometimes the splash did not come. And they had to learn that soundless fall too. Rhaenys had once wondered whether she'd been made to conquer or to collect. Standing there, she thought perhaps she had been made to sew. The thread was the color of fruit flesh. The cloth cut her fingers. The pattern had pieces no one had ever drawn before, and parts so old that they had been mistaken for nature. She drew the needle through again, and listened for the river's song through the ring of hammers, and the thrum of dragon wings, and the sentences men used when they thought no one was listening. On the day the first caravan from the marches arrived under a white flag tangled with a yellow one, bearing both resentment and olive oil, Rhaenys sat at the top of the spear tower and played a small lute she had bought from a boy at the Greenblood, the instrument's back made of a gourd rubbed with lime oil. Nemor lay with his head in her lap and his eyes closed, which was the way he listened when he trusted the moment. She plucked a tune as clean as the line of a dragon's flight. "Sing," he said without opening his eyes. "They will hear you in the Shadow City and hate you for a little, and then join in." "I will sing," she said, "when the wind has something to say back." The wind, because it liked her now, lifted and made conversation. She sang then, not a Valyrian tune nor a Dornish river song, but something with both in it, the vowels shifting like light on water, the rhythm keeping a dragon's cadence without frightening the horses on the road below. Somewhere far north, Visenya sat writing a letter that would scald a lordling into wisdom for 7 days. Somewhere to the west, Aegon laid another stone where there would one day be a beam, and he did it with a craftsman's satisfaction instead of a king's boredom, for he had come to understand the pleasures of making a thing that lasted longer than fear. Somewhere inland, a child with a scar across her lip told a man at market that he would have to look up, and when he did, he saw a hawk and smiled with his mouth closed. Rhaenys sang until the sun dipped and the thread between water and fire hummed like a string pulled tight. When she stopped, Nymer's hand lifted and found hers without searching. His thumb pressed the inside of her wrist where the pulse was stubborn. He did not count. Meraxes raised her head and blew out a coil of smoke that lay on the air, and then dissolved. The day thinned. The bridge held. The river talked on in its low grammar, and the sea kept its counsel, and there was room in the light for both banners to move without tearing each other. Kai. They arrived with faces that had learned to be smooth whatever the hand beneath them felt. Hightower men wore their robes like arguments, each fold and fall carrying a precedence, and their hair was arranged as if it had opinions. Their leader, in a saffron mantle that pretended to be humble by being less saffron than the rest, was called Ormond, a younger brother to a cousin of the current Lord Hightower, which is to say he was a branch sturdy enough to bend without breaking. He bowed to Namor and Rhaenys together and let the wind lift the edge of his mantle just as he rose, a gesture that suggested the wind and he had been practicing. "Prince, princess," he said, "Old Town sends salt as well as words." He gestured, and 2 men opened a chest to reveal cakes of white so fine it might have been powdered moon, and oil. "We hear the river remembers the flavor. Old Town is generous," Nymer said. "The river never forgets generosity. It also never forgets insult. We plan to give it more of the first." Ormond's smile did not change. The High Septon asks if Dorne means to stand with the realm while keeping its own modes of standing. "The High Septon asks many things," Rhaenys said lightly. "He will have ample opportunity to ask them again when we ride to Old Town for the anointing. Has he kept the starry sept polished as he promised Aegon?" Ormond almost laughed. She saw it pull at his mouth and fade. He has kept it very polished. He would like no sand on the stones. Sand is honest, Nymor said. It shows where feet have been. Old Town prefers to show where feet ought to go, Ormond said. Then it is wise we come, Rhaenys said, before Nymor could tilt toward a sharper answer. We will watch where the feet go and decide if the places agree with us. They ate on the gallery where the shade drew squares upon the stone. Ormond brought news with his oil. The Tyrells had sent lemons and a letter full of suggestions disguised as congratulations. A ship from Les had come to port with silk that made Maester Tiro lean forward and inhale and then sit back as if filled. A certain septon in the marches had preached a sermon about the dangers of women deciding their own futures, and had found his church empty the next day save for one old man who sat in the front pew the next day save for one old... It was good news and news that needed watching, which is the kind of news that makes men useful to kings. After the oil and the words had found their places, Ormond asked to see the dragon. It was a request, wrapped like a gift and heavy as a test. Rhaenys led him where Meraxes lay in the heat, eyes half-lidded. The membranes like watered silk dragged lazily up and down across depths that did not care about men or their mantles. Ormond stood at a distance that a dragon would ignore and a court would admire. Rhaenys watched his hands. They did not shake. He had practiced that too, she thought. How not to look terrified when presented with something that could make you a crisp by sneezing. She is very beautiful, he said, and his voice was honest for the first time that day. She knows, Rhaenys said. She lets people tell her so because it pleases them. Then she is kinder than most beauties, Ormond said. The High Septon will need reassurances. Tell him he will have them, Rhaenys said, surprising Nymor, who turned his head at a fraction. Tell him Dorne is not a hunger that will eat his flocks. Tell him we have laws and will keep them. Tell him we will stand with the realm when the whole needs our standing. Tell him we will not pretend to be what we are not. He will choose whether that calms him or gives him new sermons. Either way, his part is clear. Ormond inclined his head. I shall tell him this. I think he likes clarity when he can have it. He will like our lines better, Nymor said. When the Hightower men had gone, Lara of the Orphans folded herself onto a low stool with her pipe across her knees and said, Men in high towers always forget how the river sounds. It's good to remind them before they start naming the banks after themselves. They name things a long way from the water, Nymor said. They do it in rooms without windows, Lara said. It makes them brave. Rhaenys watched the sails grow small and then vanish on the horizon. She kept the taste of Ormond's honesty for later. Honest moments were like figs that ripened together and could not all be eaten at once. Then she went to the courts with Nymor and stood on the cool tiles, where the sun could not reach, and listened while men and women spoke the small litigations that bind a place more tightly than large wars. A woman's goat had eaten a man's vines. A child had fallen into a cistern and been pulled out by a boy, who now wanted a copper for each day she'd been wet, because he claimed she would have drowned otherwise and her mother had not drowned him in gratitude. A man had beaten his sister because she had refused to marry his friend. The sister had shoved him into a brazier. The friend's hair had caught fire, and he had run out into the street, setting 3 baskets of wool alight. There were no perfect answers. There were answers that made room for the imperfect. What does the law say? Rhaenys asked over and over, and the men who thought she was a dragon in a dress learned that the law stood between men and women like the shade between the sun and a courtyard. It could be stretched, but you needed poles and ropes and practice, and more than one person to do it well. News came then like a stone thrown up through a well shaft. A skirmish at the Boneway. A lordling from Nightsong riding farther south than his grandfather would have dared. The kind of probing any body makes against a new scar. There were hostages taken and released, and a dead boy whose mother wrote a letter so full of rage that the ink bled into the parchment and left it smelling of iron. Go with me, Nymor said to Rhaenys, not because he thought she would refuse, but because naming desire makes it cleaner. Let them see both banners on one horse. They went. The Boneway was a throat cut twice by gods and patched with stone by men, and the wind there had a different language than the one it spoke by the sea. Rhaenys let Meraxes croon above them and kept her on the high currents. where no scorpion bolt could touch a wing, because none were made that could reach a dragon who didn't invite them. She remembered Maria's bead clicks in the low room, and felt the understanding of the old woman's way pass through her, like someone else's breath in her lungs. At the Boneway, Lord Will had sent a nephew to speak for him, and the nephew had a mouth like a slit purse and a narrow way of looking at the world. On the Stormland side, a man with a swan on his chest. Celis? No, Swan. A younger son of House Swan from Stonehelm, his name a smooth thing that might slip out of your hand, had come to talk and to see if talking would make his lord proud. They spoke where the wind made all mouths dry. "We will mark the road with stones," Nymor said. "We will put your sigils on the stones so your men remember where they promised not to trespass, and we will put ours on our side for the same reason." "You cannot mark sand with stone," the Swan boy said, as if the words cut a knot. "You can if you set enough stone," Rhaenys said, amused. "We have more stone than patience at present. Let us use it." "We will not have your garrisons near the passes," the Will nephew said. And his slit-purse mouth grew thinner with the effort of not baring teeth. "Then do not make us need them," Nymor said, and added gently, "The passes would not like the taste of dragon's breath. They are too old for such spice." They made their stones. They made them tall and hard to pretend not to see, and Rhaenys added a ribbon to the top of each. Blue at one pass, indigo at another, so that wind would speak of the border long after men stopped thinking about it. The Swan boy touched one of the ribbons as if it were a snake, and said something that made his men laugh, and then look guilty for laughing. The Will nephew failed to laugh at all. He did not like things that did not fall into slots he already knew. On their way back to Sunspear, a hawk stooped at a green snake in the road. Rhaenys reined in to watch. The hawk's shadow stretched and snapped like a whip. The snake flowed toward the rocks and disappeared, and the hawk hit only sun-warmed stone. It lifted again, feathers scolding. "Not everything that moves under the sun is yours," Nymor said to the hawk, and the hawk tilted its head as if it too had been practicing courtly airs. Letters flew and landed. Aegon's hand grew larger with crown work and remained spare when he wrote to her. Visenius' lines got shorter as the lists of things to be watched lengthened. Orys wrote as if leaning with one shoulder against a door, all good humor and bone under it. He said, "I am making the marchers drink with me. It is my favorite weapon. I pour, and then I tell them what they have said, and they nod because they cannot remember saying it. Then I make them say it again." He added, in a line that had more edge than the rest, "Be careful in the hells." By hells he meant one place in particular, the Hellhole. House Uller kept it, and had kept hatred like a worship there for 100 years. They had flavors of hatred the rest of Dorne had forgotten. They did not love rivers. They loved stones and iron, and the way heat could keep a man awake into an ugly clarity. "We will go," Rhaenys said, when the letter calling them came. "Better now than when they have set the table with knives, and we are already seated." "You will not fly low," Nymor said. "I will not fly low," she agreed. She would not give fate the satisfaction of thinking it could predict her stubbornness. The Hellhole looked as if a god had clenched his fist around a mountain, and not quite finished squeezing. It liked men to be small and hot. Its lord, Ulwick Uller, had a face that had learned to smile like a knife. His daughter, whose beauty sat upon her like a cat that might scratch, watched with her chin slightly lifted and her eyes taking measurements. The men around them wore impatience in their shoulders. Their weapons looked as if they had stories that ended with someone else not having a head. Rhaenys felt Merax's overhead as a shadow larger than fear. "And there go bane and fear." Ulwick Uller said he would speak only in the yard. He said it coldly, which here meant at a temperature that would bake bread, and with a pride that would have had to be fed if it had been a creature in a cage. Rhaenys took off her cloak and let the yard see she was not a person who would be wrung by heat. Nymor rolled his shoulders once, as if settling a pack he had carried since birth. "You have brought a dragon," Ulwick said to Rhaenys, though his eyes were on Nymor as if looking for a sign of petition. "I always bring my dragon," Rhaenys said. "The question is whether she comes down." "She will not," Nymor said, and his voice made the urge to argue look foolish before it showed its face. Ulwick's mouth smiled against his will. He possessed a sense for the few pleasures worth his regard. "Your laws from the river are not laws in stone," he said. "You write words soft as water, and expect them to carve my house." "Water carves stone," Lara said behind Rhaenys, absent-mindedly with her pipe unlit between her fingers, as if it were a reed she meant to weave. "It takes time. You can stand and watch, or you can look away and pretend you are not getting smaller." "Nenawasuni." Ulwick ignored her. He enjoyed ignoring women the way some men enjoy difficult wines. "My son is dead," he said. "He thought your banner a carpet and danced upon it, and your men shortened him. I would hear you say what I am owed." "You are owed our regret for your loss," Nemor said, and the word regret was clean in his mouth. "You are owed the certainty that when you send yours to dance upon our banners again, we will not pretend to like the steps. You are owed the knowledge that you died less in that moment than you might have," Rhaenys added. And she knew it for a dangerous sentence even as she delivered it. She had learned when to be careful, and when to let the weapon she was unsheathe itself. "If Meraxes had been with that patrol, your son would have been ash. He was not. He fell to steel. He was lifted and his body given back to you. That is not nothing." Lindandero, Ulwick's daughter. Her name was Sorella, which is to say her mouth should have been soft. It was not watched Rhaenys as if removing a glove with her eyes. "You speak as if you are kind," she said. "Dragons are not kind." "Kindness is not the only good," Rhaenys said, and met her gaze, which had no patience for pretense. "But if you are choosing how to be killed, steel is a mercy next to fire." "Your mercy," Sorella said, "depends on pride." "So does yours," Rhaenys said. "Or you would be sitting, not standing." They would have stood there all day, throwing the kind of sentences men make knives of and women turn into scaffolding, but the day had its own agenda. There was a sudden stir in the yard, the movement that is not quite panic and not quite practice. Rhaenys felt it before she saw it. Men rushed to the walls with a purpose too quick to be pried. Nymor's head tilted and then turned, the way a man turns from the wind to the source of smoke. Above them, a shape like a tiny scorpion unfolded along the battlements, its line thick and black against the sky. "Down," Nymor said, and Rhaenys was already moving. Not because she had seen it, but because she felt the breath in the yard change. There was a hiss, a sound like iron shoved through a mouth that tried to bite it. The bolt would not have reached Meraxes. Rhaenys had chosen her height with more than love. But it could have reached men in the yard, and it was meant to be seen, which is a different kind of harm. The bolt hit a pillar and went through it, and half the pillar fell and cracked like a broken bell. In the sky, Meraxes roared. Not the roar of fury, which Rhaenys knew like her own hands, but the roar that says, "I sent what is not me, and I call it enemy." Rhaenys lifted her face and whistled, high and thin, the call that meant stay. She would not let the yard be a kiln. Ulwick's hand went to his knife, and then stopped. Sorella's face did not move, which was its own movement. Nemor did not touch Rhaenys, which told her how careful he was being not to do what his body wanted. 4 men wrestled with the scorpion on the wall, their faces showing that they had expected to be brave in a story with a different ending. "Stop," Nemor said, in a voice that had weight to it men would carry without knowing why. "Take it apart. Bring the parts here." "Those are Uller walls," Ulwick said, and for the first time, there was something not pride in his voice. "They are Dornish walls," Nymor said. "They are my walls. Your son is dead because he did not know the difference. I will not let your house swallow that lesson and call it a victory." They took the scorpion apart. They carried it down, 4 men straining, their arms showing cords like ropes in a storm. They laid it at Nemor's feet like a beast killed in the field, and Nymor placed his palm upon it very gently, which was more dangerous than if he had kicked it. "This is not the thing that will hold us together," he said. "This is the thing that will make our hands shake for a year when we lift cups. Burn it." "Not with dragon fire," Ulwick said quickly, as if men's bodies were tinder even at the word. "No," Rhaenys said and smiled, because she wanted him to feel the narrowness of his escape and the wideness of her intention. "With oil and our own breath." They burned it in the yard, and smoke lifted like a priest's prayer when he has finally found the word he means. Sorella watched the flames with a hunger Rhaenys recognized. It was not a hunger for war, but for power that does not smell like anyone else's hands. Ulrich took off his mantle and stood with his shirt sticking to his ribs, and did not speak again until the scorpion lay in legs and ash. "My daughter will come to Sunspear," he said, as if deciding only in that moment. "She will watch with your eyes. If she finds your eyes like mine, she will come home. She will not be anyone's hostage," Rhaenys said. "She will make of Sunspear what she can. If she does not like the taste of it, she will wash her mouth out in her own water." "Men Samra was out." Ulrich nodded once, stiff as a man in armor in his own skin. Sorella's mouth tightened, which was how she smiled when she considered it unwise to show softness. "I like salt," she said. "I will taste yours." On the ride back, Lara blew 3 low notes, and 1 high. And Namor, who had learned her music without knowing he had, said, "We will need to send men to the Hellhold, who are not afraid of heat and pride. We will pay them in rain." "We will send women," Rhaenys said. "Women who learned to say no and were not killed for it. They will sit in the courts, and they will not let the men stand for too long while they talk." He laughed, surprised by his own gladness. "We will send men and women, and oil, the kind for lamps and the kind for food." They layered the days with this kind of weaving, pulling one strand through another until the pattern began to show itself to those who had not been squinting for it. There were petitions from Skyreach, fowlers who insisted their Eyrie be respected like a prickly god, and from Starfall, where the Danes kept their memories wrapped in silk and their pride folded neatly in drawers. At Starfall, a boy with eyes too old for his face looked at Dark Sister in Visenya's hands when she visited and said, "Our sword named Dawn is older." And Visenya said, "Then keep it old and sharp, and do not use it to cut your own foot." And the boy looked as if a saint had given him a strangely practical blessing. Visenya came to Sunspear once at Rhaenys' urging, and the sun rolled over her armor like a coin across a knuckle. She stood in the training court with Namor, and took a spear from Sorella Uller's hand, and let its balance teach her in a single pass what others learn in a season. The orphans gathered on the walls and made a soft sound in their throats when steel met shaft, because they liked to witness new music. Visenya and Namor moved like a pair of thoughts that entered the mind together and only later proved to have been one. When the spear flicked up under her guard, Visenya smiled with half her mouth. When Dark Sister's flat kissed Namor's forearm, he stepped back as if enjoying a well-cooked egg. They'd both have taken blood, had they been men who needed to prove they were what they were. They were not, and so they stopped without injury, which made the respect in the court a cooler thing. "You will hate this sometimes," Visenya said to Rhaenys that evening, under an awning where the wind ran its fingers through fringe. "Their laws and their rivers, and their insistence on naming their own walls. You will hate that you cannot solve a thing by lighting it and watching it turn to something simpler." "And I have learned to like not simple," Rhaenys said, thinking of scorpion bolts and beads that counted heartbeats. "You will hate this sometimes. Their laughter, their oranges, their refusal to be frightened by our shadows." Visenya looked past her to where Meraxes lay, as if carved from dusk. She did not agree. She did not disagree. "We will need the faith," she said. "Not for the gods. They will sit whatever men do. But for the people who need the gods to sit where they expect them, we will tell the faith we have brought new water to the realm," Rhaenys said. "If they have any sense, they will bless a thing that keeps men alive." Visenya's mouth did not smile. Her eyes did. "I am writing to Orys. He will sit in the hall with the marchers and drink them quiet. I will sit beside the High Septon and let him sniff me like a cat sniffing vinegar. Aegon will build, because that is what he likes when war is not asking to be courted. Dumb. And I will sow," Rhaenys said. "Your fingers will bleed," Visenya said, and reached out and took one hand and turned it palm up and looked at the places where the needle had already made small scars. "They will call them dragon bites. Let them." They went to Old Town with the autumn descending into a stern beauty. The starry sept wore light like armor and shadow like a priest's sly joke. The High Septon looked as if the seven had asked him to sit on all the world's anxieties at once, and he had agreed, and was uncomfortable. The faith had long fingers and longer memories. It did not like to have anyone else tell it how far they should reach. Aegon came with Balerian's heat still in the stones behind him, and men bowed because something in them wanted to when he stood under those painted stars. The ceremony was a river with banks too narrow. Rhaenys stood in a hall that wanted to be cooler than it could, and felt the crowd's breath move like a beast. The High Septon anointed Aegon with oils that smelled of herbs more suited to a north garden. He spoke words that had been spoken over men who had never known dragons and would have run from their own shadows. He looked sometimes at Rhaenys, and more often at Nemore, and when he did not flinch, which earned him a small good mark in her private ledger. After, when the oil had dried and the crown sat on Aegon's head with the ease of a hat he had forgotten to remove, they met in a chamber where the windows were high and mean. The High Septon placed his hands inside his sleeves and said, "Dorne keeps laws that are not ours." "Dorne keeps Dorne," Namor said. "You keep the seven. There is room." "The seven make room when asked," the High Septon said, which was a sentence so exact it might have been scripture if he had spoken it slightly less like a man defending his carpets. "We will not bless any law that allows men to refuse duty to their houses." "You have blessed other refusals," Rhaenys said, very gently. "You have blessed men who refuse to fight if their God calls them to sit in white and watch. You have blessed women who refuse men for every reason that isn't the one we named. Refusal is not a sin. Only the reason for it can be." "Then the High Septon looked at her, as if seeing how her mouth worked when she produced such a line. "You will not make paramours holy." "We will not," Namor said, and Rhaenys felt Visenya's surprise slip across the floor like a shadow. "But we will not make them a crime. We will not lie because it makes men more comfortable." The High Septon's hands tightened in his sleeves and then relaxed. He looked at Aegon, who looked at Rhaenys, who looked back, and those glances did more work than half the letters sent that year. "We will publish a tract," the High Septon said at last, and the word publish sounded like a spear thrown, saying that we accept the customs of Dorne, insofar as they do not require men elsewhere to make their women behave like Dornish women. "Your tract will be read," Rhaenys said. "The women will make what they will of it." On the second night in Old Town, a fire started in a warehouse near the Citadel, where oil and old papers slept together like two bored cats. The wind put on armor. The city learned how much it had forgotten about the fear heat can teach. Ormond Hightower's smoothness cracked into efficiency. Bells ran up and down the tower like goats. Men formed lines and passed buckets. Women ran to the river, threw their skirts over their heads, and came back wet and fierce and unshamed. Rhaenys took Meraxes up and then higher still, and then turned her in such a way that the dragon's breath poured thin and careful along the edges of buildings that would die if the fire did, made a corridor men could run through with their shoulders unblackened. The High Septon stood on the starry sept steps, with his hands lifted as if calling rivers from stone. Aegon's hair smelled of smoke the next morning. Visenya fell asleep for 4 hours with her cheek on Dark Sister's hilt, and woke with the hilt's pattern on her face like a temporary tattoo. When they left, the bells were quiet again, and the starry sept stones looked smug, which amused Rhaenys more than it should have. She kissed Ormond's cheek, because she had decided he would benefit from having to pretend that did not matter. And he flushed then, and that pleased her too. The High Septon took her hand in both of his and said, "You are correct. Sand is honest. It is the men who carry it into my halls who are not." And she laughed, and he laughed, and the sound made a new shelf in her mind where she kept events worth remembering because they were unlikely. They came home to Sunspear to find the fig trees in a mood, and the children on the riverbanks more expert than they had been when she left, which is how children are. Sorella Uller had taken to sitting under the shade of the spear tower, and watching the way men's tempers changed as shadows lengthened. She offered no advice and learned at all the uses of silence. Lord Euronwood sent a boar with its tusks gilded, and a letter that managed to be warm and offensive at once, which is how he would show affection until he died or changed his bones. Lara played a tune she said had come to her while she slept in Egonfort with water dripping on her hair, and it had the exact number of notes a good solution needs. Not everything fit. There were cracks. A caravan from the west was set upon near the scourge, by men who wore no colors, and carried no banners, and said nothing when taken, and then took poison when their mouths were forced open. Their lips turned a blue that looked almost pretty. Rhaenys stood over them with her hands behind her back and said, "This is not a language I like." Nemor set a reward not for names, which only make men drunk with imagination, but for evidence: who bought the poison, who forged the knives, who opened the gate the night before the caravan passed. A boat with sails the gray of old teeth was seen off Planky Town. A week later, a woman with a scar on her arm brought to Lara a scrap of cloth that smelled of Myrish spice and tar, and a list of prices, and the name of a man who called himself a captain because he did not like the way his own name tasted in his mouth. Rhaenys took Meraxes to Planky Town and flew circles like Patience until the gray sails returned, and then she brought the sky down in a narrow column that ate just that ship and slicked the water for a day with oil and certainty. In the third spring after their vows, Rhaenys built a fountain in the corner of the Aegon fort, where the stones had always been honest about wanting something more than a place to be stepped upon. She had a mason from God's grace shape it like a pair of cupped hands, and set a small dragon carved from pale river stone between the thumbs. The water trickled over its head in a way that made the sound of a woman soothing a child. The Faith frowned and then relaxed, because the water kept the men in the hall cooler and less inclined to sin by sweating on other men's papers. Aegon touched the water sometimes with the tips of his fingers before he sat to judge, and Visenya pretended not to notice that he had begun doing it, the way she pretended not to notice when Rhaenys set fresh limes on his table. Rhaenys found she was often tired in a way that felt like the earth being tired after spring plowing. Good tired, not despair. She bled less than she had before. She bled later. She told no one because there was nothing to say yet that words could hold without making a mess. Nymor recognized nothing in her and everything, which is to say he held his tongue and brought her water and did not ask why she had paused when climbing the spear tower stairs, and laughed when she laughed too hard at a boy falling over his own sandals, and then bowed with a flourish to make his dignity equal to his tumble. One evening, when the light lay aslant like a blade set down and forgotten, and the air had the weight of a woman's braid dipped in oil, Lara of the Orphans came to the cliff house with her pipe not in her belt, but in her hand. Rhaenys knew that meant news. Lara sat with her feet tucked under her and looked out at the line where sea and sky argued about who owned the horizon. "There is a man in the Shadow City," she said, "who has been buying spears of a particular length and asking for feather-fletched bolts from 3 different makers. He talks of hunting birds. He does not smell like a hunter. He smells like a story he wants to tell men later to make them think he is braver than he is." Rhaenys felt Meraxes shift where she lay, the way she always did when danger went by, like a cart with a loose wheel. "Where?" Lara told her. Rhaenys and Namor put on plain clothes that were better woven than they looked and went down, taking 4 orphans with them and no men from the spear tower, because walls can make a man think he is different than he is when he goes out. The street off the market smelled like vinegar and crushed figs and men's breath. The man with the spears had a face that wished it could be handsomer and eyes that did arithmetic without doing courtesy. He did not try to run. He tried to make them pretend to be surprised. He had 3 bolts and a cloth and a story he had told himself that made him upright. Rhaenys watched his mouth as he lied and felt tired, not because of his lies but because of how little imagination it takes to kill. They took him without hurting him. They took the man who had sold him the fletching. They took the boy who had carried pieces between them, because men often forget that boys carry more than they are told to, and remember it later when it lets them look important. "What did you intend?" Nemor asked the spearmen in the cool room, where the sound of water was as soft as a banker's voice. "Practice," the man said, because he had learned to lean on a word when he had nothing else. "What did you intend?" Rhaenys asked, and he looked at her with the tiny hope some men keep for women's foolishness. And then he saw the river in her eyes and told the truth. He had intended to wait until a dragon shaded him, and then make himself a hero by dying for men who would use his name for a week, and forget it the week after. "You would not have killed her," Nymor said, not to soothe but to educate. You would have made us kill you, and then done nothing but put fear back in men who had just learned not to be governed by it. You will not die, Rhaenys told him, and his face changed in a way that made her want to box it. You will build things. You will carry water for women who can no longer carry it. You will climb stairs and sweep them. You will make yourself useful until you forget you wanted to be a story told by idiots. He spit at her feet, and then looked at Namor as if pleading for a cleaner end. Namor sighed and said, "If you spit again, you will eat sand for a day, and then drink brine until you understand what you wasted." The man did not spit again. He went to carry water. He carried water until his shoulders learned an honest ache. He learned to say good morning before he spoke any other words, which is how men learn to be men again. Rhaenys thought of cannonballs that had been turned into stairweights by a people who hadn't used them in years. It pleased her to think of weight serving grace. When the rains came that year, they came as if repenting. The streets sluiced clean for a day, and then dirty again. Because people are people. Children ran and fell and laughed and got up and learned what their knees are for. Maester Tiro, who had been a young man for 30 years before Rhaenys met him, and had now become what men call old because of the time that had passed above him, taught a class in the lower court to anyone who wished to come. He spoke about Rhoynar letters, and the way a word looks different when written on clay than when written on paper. Sarella Uller brought a small slate, and used the chalk like a weapon, until she learned how to make it a tool. Lara sat in the back and hummed and corrected his pronunciation when he forgot how the river speaks. A letter came from the west that was just a list of names. No signature. The names were men who had been taken by the same gray-sailed captain whose ship had fed the crabs. The list ended with one more name. A girl who had been on the riverbank too late one evening because she had not wanted to go home to a stepfather who told stories with his hands. Rhaenys took the list to Aegon and put it on his table, and the water on the carved dragon's head seemed louder to her as it ran. "We will clean the stepstones," Aegon said. "We are busy here, but our navy can be busy there. Orys knows men in the marches who learned boats before they learned horses. He will choose among them. You will need a man who knows how men lie for a living," Visenya said, looking at the ink's color and not at Rhaenys, which was her way of being tender. "Men with grins for masks. Send a woman, and he will either underestimate her or fall in love with her. Send both." And now, they sent both. They sent a captain from Blackcrown whose left ear had been knife-bitten, and a woman from Spotswood who could throw a net better than any fisherman, and had once stabbed a man with a quill, because a pen happened to be in her hand when he deserved a wound. Rhaenys watched their sails go sharp against the morning glare, and thought of the way the river teaches men, which is to say slowly, painfully, and in the end, effectively. Weeks later, a boy came back with a lump of ambergris and 3 tales that contradicted each other, and a ship that stank of triumph. The gray-sailed captain had gone down with his ship and his name because Rhaenys decided not to keep it. The girl was not among the saved. Her name stayed on Rhaenys' list in her mind, where it took a new place and changed nothing and everything. On the day Sarella Uller returned to the Hellholt for a week to see the taste of home again, Rhaenys walked with her as far as the shade ended. Sarella had a new way of carrying her shoulders and a new habit of tapping her thumb's nail against her forefinger. She had learned to hold silence the way the orphans hold water, easy and heavy. "You have made something here," she said. And it was not an admission. It was an inventory. "My father pretends to like it less than he does. He will like it more when he sees which men hate it most. You could help him like it better," Rhaenys said. "You could be the one who tells him what the men who hate it most will do." Sarella smiled that unsoft smile. "I will be the one who does something before they decide. Then I will let him think it was his idea. That is the kindness we owe men who insist upon owning their ideas." "You owe them nothing," Rhaenys said. And there was steel there, and Sarella looked at her with interest. "I owe myself a life where I do not waste time in resistance when there are easier victories," she said, and tilted her face so the light cut it clean. "I will send you limes from our wells. Your cook makes fish taste like a well-kept secret." "Lara," Rhaenys said. "She makes secrets into meals." Sarella's laughter was a dry thing like good tinder. "She will not like me. I will like her. She does not like anyone until they disappoint her, and then she is very fond. Rhaenys said. Good, Sorella said. I will arrange my disappointments carefully. When Sorella was gone, Rhaenys lay with Nymor on the balcony, and the wind spoke as if it had been running and needed to tell someone. She put his hand on her belly and watched his mouth learn a new shape. Not yet, he said. Not yet, she agreed. But soon, I will not be able to pretend I am not tired when I walk. Visenya will be unbearable, he said. She will be useful, Rhaenys said. And unbearable. Both are things I like about her. Will you fly? He asked. I will fly high, she said. And he accepted that, because he had learned that the only way to pluck a dragon's feather is to let the dragon offer it. The day she told Aegon, he touched her hair, the part near her temple, where the sun had lifted color, and said nothing for a long while. Then he put his palm on the fountain's water and set it against her cheek, where it dried without leaving a trace, and said, I will build something for this child. And when Visenya came later, she placed one hand on Rhaenys' belly without asking. Because you do not ask a sister for permission, and said, I will write something for this child, and then sat down and did it. A letter to her future self of what she would forget if she did not pin it with ink. Do you think it will be a boy? Lara asked, braiding reeds in Rhaenys' courtyard as if they were hair she had cut and kept. I think it will be a child, Rhaenys said. And later, it will be a man or a woman, and later still a person who thinks too much or just enough, and eats too fast and laughs when they should not. And I think I will be tired and glad. Nymor said nothing to anyone. He sat with his feet in a basin of cool water, and watched the light move along the edge of it, as if reading a script only he could see. He began to carry small things with him, nuts, bits of sugared peel, to put into Rhaenys' hand when the day turned sideways. He became more careful with his own body, which is a thing men do not know how to do until they fear their usefulness will be lost. They did not stop being what they had been. The marchers sent a boy with a scribe's careful hand and a lord's careless mouth to test the stones at the pass. He poked one ribbon with a stick and wrote a report that used the word insolent about a piece of cloth. The Hightowers sent a novice with a chest full of books bound in calfskin, and a question about how the river might carry ideas as easily as boats. The Lannisters sent a cup that was too heavy and a letter too light. The Tyrells sent 3 gardeners who wanted to learn how water can make a garden where heat says no bow-ow. The Greyjoy in his far islands sent nothing because he had been taught that silence makes men more afraid than letters. The Starks sent a pelt and an agreement written in words so spare they might have been breath marks, and that pleased Rhaenys very much. Underneath the good, a rot began in a corner that seemed clean. Men who had learned to be brave by saying yes to the old fights felt themselves thinned by all these new surrenders, which is how it looked to them, and whispered in the alleys where air only moved when someone pushed it. A sellsword with a scar that made his smile permanent taught them a song about dragons that did not breathe fire but water. Boys took it up because boys like to be naughty, and because water is funnier than fire when you do not stand next to it. Maester Tiro wrote notes in a hand more shaky than before. He wrote, There is a man from Tyrosh with an eye that looks like a fish and one that looks like a coin. Watch him. He writes better than he speaks. He also wrote, I cough at night. It is not the heat. Which is a way men tell you they are preparing to leave before the gods take the choice from them. Rhaenys went to see him in his small room, with windows no bigger than a book. He had taken the beads from Miria's hand when she died and wrapped them around a peg in the wall. He touched them sometimes as if the counting had remained inside them. She sat beside him and drank lime water, and put the cup into his hand after, and watched him drink too, because he forgot to on his own. He told her the story of a girl who had learned to write on clay, and then on paper, and then on skin, her own, and then discovered paper again and was very glad, which made him laugh and then cough and then apologize for doing both. She told him the story of a man who thought a boat would get heavier if he gave it a name, and so never did, and then kept losing it in fog. I have loved you, he said suddenly, and she blinked, because he had always been proper with his adoration. Then he added, the way an old man loves a proof he has carried in his head without ever writing it out. and then you write it out, and it does not shame him. Do not be offended by an old man's mathematics." "Nah, I am not," Rhaenys said, and took his hand, and he cried then, because old men who love proofs are allowed to cry with one person, and it is best if that person does not tell anyone until his body is no longer busy. When he died, 2 days later, simple as a candle that had burned itself to its intended end, she wrapped the bead string around her wrist and felt it too heavy. She took it off and put it on Maria's chair, and told no one whose it had been. Lara made a low sound in her throat that could have been a song or a prayer, or both. Nemor bowed his head in a way he did for nothing else. When he raised it, his mouth had a shape that said he had moved his grief to a place where it could hold hands with use. The child grew. The realm learned to speak with 2 kinds of mouth. One it used in the markets, one in the courts. Rhaenys began to walk more slowly and to sleep like falling, without dreams. She flew less. When she did, she flew so high that the land became a map she could fold with her eyes. Sometimes the world is more merciful when viewed from a remove. Sometimes the mercy is blindness. She kept herself within the kind of mercy that made her honest. She visited the Greenblood and let the orphans' children touch her bare forearm to see if the skin of a woman with a dragon could be like theirs. She watched them argue about boats and mothers with the seriousness of saints. On a day when the sky wore every blue it owned, and then some, word came that men had gathered near Kingsgrave with spears and speeches. Manwoody banners fluttered near rocks that had seen more vows broken than kept. Rhaenys could have sent men without herself. She did not, because there are moments where the bridge you have made needs the weight of your foot. They went with 50 and came upon 100 who wanted to be seen as more than 100 by the telling. The Manwoody lord, lady, in fact. A woman with hair like a storm and hands that could fold a tent in half, stood on a rock as if the rock liked her. She spoke of old wars in a way that did not stir blood so much as stiffen sinews. She wanted a leader's bargain, to be told no with enough dignity that she could say yes without losing her own face. "We will watch your border with you," Nemor said. "We will not feed your young men to songs. We will not make you say our words when you have your own. If you are attacked, we will come. If you are the attacker, we will not pretend to like your spear." "And if you are attacked?" Lady Manwoody asked Rhaenys, which was a smarter question than the ones men had been asking so far. "Then I will ask for your spears," Rhaenys said. "And if you do not bring them, I will learn why you didn't. And after the learning, we will either be better friends or not at all." Lady Manwoody laughed. "We will be better friends," she said, "if only because the not at all sounds very boring." They drank sweet wine that made Rhaenys swear never to drink it again, and made Nemor lick his lips and wonder if he could persuade the vintner to move house. They ate a cheese that scared the orphans and delighted the swans. They watched the wind wipe a line across a distant hill as if erasing an old sentence. They slept 3 hours on rough mats and woke ready to lift the poled shade and go home. On the road, the sky bruised itself in the east for no good reason. Lara said, "I do not like this," which is a sentence that meant more than a man's warning, because she only ever said it when the river made that note in her bones. They kept the column tight. They kept the sound of their horses' feet from sliding into panic. A rock slide took the place where the road wanted to run. Rhaenys had wanted to fly that day and had not. She had listened to Nemor's eyes, which had said not today. It is possible that saved them, and it is possible that the mountain liked them. When they were almost to the Boneway stones, when the ribbons began to talk again, a boy stepped out from behind a bush with a knife that had belonged to his father and courage that had not. He was too young to have learned where courage belongs. He put the knife to Rhaenys' horse's neck and said, "Make peace with my lord." And his mouth shook on the word Lord, which told Rhaenys that the Lord had been a wet man with bad breath. "Put down the knife," she said. "You do not need a lord to make you a man." He dropped it. He cried. He ran. She let him. Behind a stone on the other side of the road, a man who had been waiting to be killed by a dragon exhaled, because he had decided not to be. The sound was almost nothing. "She hears everything," Nemor said later, and Lara wiped her pipe with her thumb and did not argue. That winter was a slighter thing than some and a heavier thing than others. The oranges did not come as lushly as the previous year, but the limes were sweeter, and men pretended they had planned it. Old Town sent books again, and with them, a young man who looked at Rhaenys as if she were a theater of the gods. She put him to work copying laws, and he found that holiness can be ink-stained and still be worth worshipping. The High Septon sent a tract with footnotes that crawled like ants. He had indeed published as promised, and it was exactly offensive enough to the right men that Rhaenys laughed out loud and handed it to Visenya, who smiled with her eyes again and put it in her locked chest. Rhaenys' child kicked against her hand like a fish. She began to sing to it in the language of the river, and the language of dragons, and the language of kings, which are not so different if you know what to listen for. Nemor spoke into the curve of her belly and told the child stories about Lyme, because men often think they must give their children what they love most, and sometimes they are right. Aegon sent a carved wooden thing that could be 3 animals depending on how you turned it. Visenya sent a knife with a handle of bone smooth as milk, and a letter saying not for the cradle, for your belt, because you will need it sooner than you think, which made Rhaenys roll her eyes and be grateful both. On a night full of lightning that refused to rain, a messenger from the marches arrived on a lathered horse, with a face that looked like he had swallowed bee stings. He had ridden from Harvest Hall with a letter from Lord Selmy that said, "We are being raided by men who ride without saddles and laugh when we hurt them. This is not a complaint. This is a request. Come drink at my table and tell me why my men cannot count. Bring the husband who keeps your rivers from drowning us. If you bring your dragon, tell her I have oxen that I do not need." Rhaenys laughed, and then sat down and looked at the map without thinking of it as a map, and saw the place where the current had begun to run the wrong way. They went to Harvest Hall with 10 men, and the orphans and Laras, Pipe doing double duty as a staff. The raiders were not raiders. They were boys from the hills who wanted to see what the world looked like when you made it look at you. They tied knots badly and cut them expertly. They stole bread and gave it to the first hungry woman they saw, which made the men hate them more than if they had stolen bread and eaten it themselves. They did not know yet if they were wolves or dogs. Rhaenys knew. She went among them and showed them how to braid their hair so it stayed out of their faces when they ran. She showed them how to unknot a rope faster than they could make it into one. She told them a story about a man who had fed his pride until it walked beside him like a second shadow, and then stepped on it and fell. Then Nemor found the man who had been bringing them knives at half their cost and half their worth, and had his wrists beaten with his own ledger. He had Visenya's letter in his pocket. He had thought to sell it for a drink. "Do you want to die?" Rhaenys asked him, very tired. "No," he said, because he found in her the desire to allow mercy, and it made him brave enough for honesty. "Then live without profit for a year," she said. "Give away knives at cost. Make men owe you something else." He looked at her as if she had asked him to grow a third arm. Then he looked at Nemor and saw the river in a man's eyes, and nodded once, because he could count. They left Harvest Hall with bread that tasted like forgiveness and cheese that tasted like a dare. Lord Selmy slapped Nemor on the back and kissed Rhaenys on the knuckles and said, "If your dragon eats any of my oxen, tell me before she shits on my roof," which is the kind of prayer that makes everyone in the room a little less polite and a little more human. The boys from the hills went home with their hair braided and new words in their pockets. Rhaenys returned to Sunspear, perhaps a little too quickly for wisdom, but wisdom and the need to sit down sometimes run at different speeds. She lay in the shade and watched the honeycomb light move like coins on the floor. Meraxes put her head into the arch and blew breath that tasted like a cavern. The child moved, and an old fear moved with it. Old because it had been carried by mothers since the first mother carried the first hope. She did not name the fear. She did not give it water. She gave her body water and ate a plate of oranges because sweetness is a shield too. She woke that night to pain that made a circle around her, and then took the circle into itself and twisted. Lara came with her hand scrubbed to the color of boiled bone, and her hair tied like a sailor's. Sorella came with a basin and a look that said this will be mine one day, and not now. Namor paced once and then sat down with his knees apart, and his hands on them, like a boy learning to be a man by not interfering. Rhaenys shrieked once and then laughed because the sound surprised her, and Lara said, "Good, let the river hear you." And Rhaenys said words in Valyrian that would have stained paper and made the Faith frown and Sorella grin, which is to say they were useful. When the child came, the room paused, the way rooms do when something has changed that will not be changed back. It took a breath. It gave it back to the world. It had black hair like spilled ink and eyes that opened and shut, as if they were weighing the light and would send a full report later. It was a girl. She was loud. Nymor cried as if someone had emptied a skin of water over him on a very hot day. Rhaenys held the child and thought, "There you are. I have been making a bridge for you, and now I must keep men from charging across it with their boots." Lara cut the cord and tied it with the string she used to knot reeds. She spat once for luck, because some old things are older than gods. Sorella stood very still and put her hand to her own belly, as if taking an oath she would not say yet. They named her Nyssa, because you name a child sometimes for a river that never has enough names. The orphans sang a song that used two melodies at once, and should have clashed and didn't. Aegon sent a chain of hammered gold with 7 links and a small dragon that opened its mouth when you pulled it. Visenya sent a book bound in red leather with blank pages and wrote on the first page, "Write here what you wish she knew, even if you cannot tell her later." And that was a knife put into the right hand. Nyssa grew like a thing made by sun and water in cooperation. She liked the fountain and hated wind until she did not. And then she loved wind in such a way that she would go missing in the house for an hour and be found on a parapet, hair in her mouth, laughing at a gull. Meraxes watched her as if she were a coal that might be useful later. Rhaenys carried her with an ease that came not from blood but from a choice often made. And Nymor carried her as if he had been practicing his whole life without knowing. The Shadow City learned her name faster than the court did. The orphans learned her weight faster than the midwives, because they had a way of weighing with hands that lives in wrists and not in eyes. The realm changed around her and did not. Men learned words like consent who had not needed them, because they had taken what they wanted. Women learned to say no and yes, with a comfort that made them afraid sometimes, and then gave them more comfort. The Faith preached and listened, and wrote and retracted. The Marchers learned to drink with Oris, and then to write letters sober. The Tyrells sent lemons and more suggestions, and once a small tree that died on the journey and made everyone sad in a ridiculous way. The Lannisters smoothed and sharpened by turns. The Starks sent silence that felt like participation. And because the world does not let bridges stand without testing them, a man came one evening with the kind of hat that lets men pass unnoticed and stood near the fountain in Eggenfort and placed a small packet on the edge of the pool that looked like nothing until it burned. It did not burn like dragon fire. It burned like a plan. The water hissed. The flame was green. Rhaenys, who had been in the gallery and had thought she would sleep, walked into the room and saw it and knew what it meant before her mind arranged the words. Visenya walked in behind her and said, "Not again," and called for sand, which is a sentence that in itself is a chronicle of a certain life. Aegon came running with no crown and a shirt half-buttoned and put his hand into the water and hissed like the flame. The packet burned out and left a stain. "From the east," Visenya said, looking at the way the stain spread with her eyes, which could pick out a drop of oil in the sea. "From a man who had to be helped into boldness by money and lies." Rhaenys looked down at the little dragon carved between the cupped hands. Its head shone with water, and the green shadow of the fading flame made it look as if New Patina had decided to live there. She touched it. "Bridges hold," she said. "Then they are attacked. Then they hold again. Or they fall, and we build them better. Or we build walls," Visenya said. "We've tried walls," Rhaenys said. "They keep out the river." "Walls keep out a great many things," Visenya said. But her mouth made that nearly smile, which told Rhaenys that her sister had decided not to argue in front of the fountain. They found the man. Old Town's book boy. Now a man with ink on his fingers that never quite washed off. Gave them a clue because he had learned to read not just letters, but faces. Ormond sent a little troop of men who had learned to walk without their robes giving them away. Lara hummed a tune that men who fear truth cannot hear. They caught him in the alley where vinegar and figs had once been. He wept like a man who had expected to die with dignity, and instead would live with shame, which is harder. He had been used like a bolt in a scorpion, which is to say he had not known what he helped to make beyond its shape. The men who bought him had laughed when they paid him. He told them the place and the time, because he had been told to tell no one, and his body wanted the opposite of what his orders required, now that he would not be paid again. They had come from Tyrosh, with a letter he had not read and a promise he had believed, because it had been sweet and foreign. Rhaenys did not burn him. She gave him to the faith, who took him and made him clean kitchens in Old Town, and when he had cleaned enough, they let him walk to the river and decide whether to jump in or wash his face. Nyssa learned to stand. She learned to fall. She learned to laugh at both, because Rhaenys put laughter on the floor like cushions before the child ever stepped. Nymor taught her to put her hand in the fountain before touching anything important. Lara taught her to blow into a pipe and make a sound that was not music, and feel proud of it anyway. Sorella taught her to sit without fidgeting when a man with a knife used his words to hurt himself. Visenya taught her to hold anything sharp, as if it would cut its holder before it cut its target. Aegon taught her to place stones where they would stay. Meraxes taught her the shadow of a dragon's wing. At night, Rhaenys lay awake and listened to the house. Houses make noises like rivers do. They talk in their beams and their tiles and their jars. She heard Maester Tyro's absence, the way a missing note sits inside a song for months and then becomes part of its beauty. She heard Nymor's breath and the small consistent breathing of a girl who had to be alive for the world to feel as if it had kept its promise. She heard wind with the strange tender irritation a woman sometimes feels at a beloved child who will not sleep. Sometimes she thought of the moment when they had burned the scorpion and wondered if some god had stood at the parapet and watched them and made a tally mark under possible. Sometimes she thought of the High Septon's hands in his sleeves and hoped he put them out to touch water without anyone watching. Sometimes she thought of a boy who had counted his coins twice and learned to look up. Once, while she stood with her palms flat on cool tile and her mind full of nothing useful, Merax's head came into the room like a wave deciding to be a stone. The dragon looked at the cradle and lifted her head a finger's width higher, which is how dragons show respect. Rhaenys cried then without any reason she would admit, and Lara said from the doorway, "Good. Let the river take that for you," and Rhaenys laughed and agreed. Word came late that year that men in the Shadow City had started to tell a new sort of tale. It was a tale that had no swords and few saints. It was a tale of a bridge and a river and a woman who had made a thread from both and sewn two banners together, not at the edges but in the middle where they would hold better. In the tale, the woman pricked her finger and bled, and it did not stain the cloth. In the tale, a little girl played beneath the table, where grown men drew their serious lines, and sometimes she reached up and moved a piece on the board, and no one noticed until the game ended, and the right man had lost. Men told this tale in wine shops and on roofs and by the river. Women told it to girls at cisterns, and to boys who tried to put a knife to a goat, and failed and cried. The High Septon heard it from a novice who flushed when he spoke, and pretended he did not know why. Aegon heard it from a sailor who swore he had first heard it in lies, and had no idea how, which is how you know a tale is true. Visenya heard it, and looked at Rhaenys and said nothing, and sharpened Dark Sister as if she were tuning an instrument. Rhaenys did not care about being a tale. That is what men who become tales say when they are not listening to themselves. But she meant it as far as she could. What she cared about was the slow, practical noise of a city that had learned a new word, and put it into its day like a coin that bought more bread than yesterday. She cared that when boys sang about dragons, the second verse now had a river in it, and was not a joke. She cared that men stole less and lied differently. She cared that Nyssa made a face at the first taste of lemon, and then ate another slice, and another, and another. Salt, Nymor whispered to their daughter, as if teaching the child a prayer. Water. Sun, shade. Names for the world you live in if you live here. Add fire, Rhaenys said, and bent to blow lightly across the child's blue-black hair. Add iron. Add thread. Add bridges. Memem sawand. Nyssa batted at her mother's braid and got her fingers tangled and learned, with the patient sorrow of the very young, that victory sometimes brings complication. Rhaenys untangled her and kissed her forehead, and put the little girl's hand into the basin, and held it there and then lifted it out, and the water fell and did not fall again. The sound was small. It was the right size for what the world requires before it lets a new thing be true. A touch, a drip, a decision. Years would do as years do. They would put dust on banners and medicine in men's hands, and make a child tall enough to stand under a dragon's shadow without crying. They would give the bridge its cracks and teach the river new corners. They would take what they always take and leave what they always leave. A story, a song, a law written in crabbed hand on thin parchment, a string of beads in an old chair that sometimes rattled in a breeze when no window was open, a fountain that sang with a new voice when the heat tried to preach. They would leave a girl who had been named for a river that never ends. For now, in the corner of Sunspear, where 3 walls made a triangle of shade and the air smelled of lime and fresh wet stone, Rhaenys Targaryen sat with her feet in a basin and her daughter on her lap and her husband's hand around both their ankles. Above them, Meraxes breathed smoke that came out in soft rings and drifted and broke and drifted again. Below, the Shadow City argued about prices and laughed at jokes and made vows and broke them and mended them after. The sea and the river talked to each other in their old low voices, and neither tried to be the other. The bridge held, and under the bridge the water moved, and after, and after, and after.